Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Kevan Funk, writer and director of the acclaimed short films A Fine Young Man, Yellowhead, and Bison, as well as a number of pretty clever music videos for bands like the Zolas, Braids, the Mounties, and A Tribe Called Quest. His first feature, Hello Destroyer, is now playing in Toronto and Ottawa and opens in Vancouver later this month. Kevan picked Safe, Todd Haynes' devastating study of a Los Angeles woman whose perfectly manicured life begins to unravel when she develops an inexplicable and apparently untreatable illness. Featuring a magnificent performance from Julianne Moore as the disintegrating Carol White and an almost inescapable sense of dread, this is a merciless, utterly unnerving psychological drama. Released in 1995, it's only grown more unsettling in the ensuing decades, and there are some pretty good reasons why. This is Someone Else's Movie.
There's a couple things about Safe. I mean, it's probably the single film that I think has most formally influenced my own work at this point. But more importantly, it's a film that, outside of any interest in like film criticism or intellectualizing the content or experience of watching it, it was such a visceral experience for me. First and foremost, I think I've written like 4 different papers in university about this film, like one each year, in different ways of looking at it. But the first time I saw it, I was working at a video store. It was sort of before Safe had its kind of resurgence of celebration, and picked it up as I knew Todd Haynes' work, and I'd already seen. I definitely had seen Velvet Goldmine and Far From Heaven. I don't think I'd seen Poison yet, but I know I'd seen those two, which obviously have more attention, and I don't think Don't Look, or I'm sorry, I think I'm Not There wasn't out yet. But anyhow, I literally like picked it off her shelf, and it was that old cover of like the weird character,
right, the
Walker,
yeah.
Which is like actually a pretty terrible cover, but the Criterion one's much better. But yeah, I picked it up, watched it, and was really profoundly affected in a way that was super emotional, and in an emotional way that is like even hard to sort of articulate or intellectualize, in the fact that it was incredibly unsettling, but in a way that felt like reflective and illuminating from my own sort of experience. Like there was a degree of immediacy that was just so powerful when I watched that film. I mean, I had I had a year in my first year of university where I had like anxiety attacks for a while, and it's not something. It was like a bit of an aberration in my life. It was about a year that I had them pretty badly, and it hasn't really been an issue so much since. But I saw that film after that, and there was something so pitch perfect in a really disturbing way about so much of how that film felt when I was watching that there was this, there's that resonance that's so close to your own experience, that was sort of my first into that film was just that. And then, and so I sort of fell in love with it just in terms of completely an emotional response the first time. And obviously a lot of the ideas that I'm so fascinated in it now, whether they're formal ones or thematic ones, were there, and I was interested in it, but that was not the initial impulse of it, where there's other films where that is the first thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's like one that I often go back to if I think about like what is my favorite film, like those have sort of shifted throughout my life, but I think at like this juncture in my life, I would probably list that film as that, which is sort of why I thought it'd be worth talking about.
Yeah. Well, it's a great choice from my point of view, because it's only more relevant now. It's the kind of film that speaks to the general disquiet of American life. That sounds incredibly pretentious, but that's what it's about. It's about the idea that you're not happy even though you have everything, and then on top of that, your body is destroying itself. Mm-hmm. The mysterious invasion of Carol White's life by whatever it is that's happening to her, which is never defined, never explained, never even really spelled out to the audience. in terms of symptoms.
Yeah.
Everything just gets worse.
Yeah.
And 10 years after the advent of AIDS, it was not that.
Yeah.
So your mind is looking for causes, and you're constantly trying to figure out what's happening. As a passive viewer in 1995, it was incredibly unnerving to just watch Julianne Moore become less on screen and have that be the disease, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so sitting through it then was disturbing and distressing. And now I turn around and we're watching people offer... I mean, it predates the internet. That's the thing that fascinates me.
Yeah.
Now you can Google your symptoms and come up with, well, it's always cancer, but whatever it
every
is.
time.
Yeah. It's either cancer or you have to reboot your computer.
Yeah.
Whatever the problem is, that's the YouTube
Or
solution.
some combination.
Yeah. But the idea of having fewer resources is actually more disturbing.
Yeah.
Because not only can she not put a name to what's happening to her, she's vulnerable to whatever is presented to her. So just strictly from a plot perspective, that's unnerving and disturbing and terrifying. Yeah. But seeing it in the present day context, I'm amazed no one has tried to do a version of it because, or maybe it's just too easy because it's happening all the time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating film, and I think talking about the way that it's aged is very interesting because since I saw it, I've been pretty obsessed with this film, and it was like really interesting to watch it sort of like garner this new sort of appreciation and acclaim. Like it sort of had, like, I think 5 years ago it started to be like a very cool film.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it was gone for a while. Like it was
totally.
I was stunned to find out that the DVD had been out of print.
Yeah, it was like as safe was the Jason Statham movie.
That's true.
The Jason Statham action movie. It was like it essentially completely disappeared. I mean, like a lot of Todd's earlier stuff is remarkably hard to find for like obviously Karen Carpenter for obvious reasons, but even Poison is like ridiculously hard film to find.
Didn't Fox Lurber have the rights for a while and then it just sort of never got remastered or something?
Yeah, and apparently I talked to a few different video stores. Apparently for some reason that like I went to rent it in Vancouver when video stores still existed, and you had to put down a $50 deposit because it gets stolen all the time for some reason, which maybe
unscrupulous film students who
who should know better and be a part of the greater good, but apparently they're not. But no, I think the fact that it's a really interesting comment on the film, how well it's aged, and the fact that it's probably become more interesting and more relevant. I always thought that, I saw it, obviously I'm born in 86, and so, I saw it, I probably saw it in like 2005 or 6 for the first time, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly, but like the backdrop of AIDS was really not part of my experience of seeing that film at all. Yeah. It really didn't even cross my mind all that much. Obviously, I knew Todd Haynes and knew his history and some of his interests, but it was not something that was on my mind when I was watching that film. And that's what I think is really interesting. I actually think that I've read a lot about the film subsequently because that's what you do. I think when you're interested in something, you kind of ingest everything about it. And I think that I wouldn't call it reductive, but I think that because I know that there's a lot of that DNA in it, and I'm not trying to change what Todd set out to do with the film, but I think that it's less interesting to look at the film just as a way to look at America grappling with the AIDS epidemic and tied specifically to that. Like, and I know that like a lot of the ideas came from that, but even listening to Todd Haynes talk about it, I feel like, again, it's one of those things where the ideas maybe come out of the experience of living through that thing, but there are all these parallels that are applicable to so many other experiences. And especially this, it's a very interesting film. I think it's one of the most interesting films on privilege that's ever been made, in terms of like an articulate criticism of privilege as well. Because one of the things that I also saw, or I also felt that always fascinated me about this film, is that I remember watching it and thinking sort of, from my how I grew up in a sort of, very liberal thinking family that's a lot about, critical engagement with issues and critical thinking and that type of thing. I remember feeling that the film was headed in a certain direction, in a healing direction, right? Where she actually does get healed. Right. And one of the things that I love so much is one of the things that I've grown to appreciate more, and is now probably one of my favorite parts of the film, is there is this great subversion of expectation in the second half where she sort of reaches this almost farcical, but very true in a lot of ways, sort of liberal haven, which is as terrifying and as problematic as as the suburban sort of nightmare that she's living in as well, which again, like I sort of had this expectation that there would be some sort of, not like a clean resolution, but that it was headed in a direction that was going to talk about this idea that, the toxicity of like suburban America, and that was the criticism of it, right. And those experiences, and the fact that it does in many ways, but the fact that it sort of pulls, again, subverts that expectation and pulls that back around, I think is one of the things that makes the film so much more interesting.
Yeah. The contemporary reading would simply be that she's being poisoned by corn syrup in the food. Like the general ugliness of America.
Yeah.
You can read that metaphor into it. And the fact that it's set in 1987 in the Reagan era where everything is still kind of perfect for her, specifically.
Yeah.
And she's
in
not,
her place.
Yeah. She is not suffering from whatever else is happening in the country. That's why I think that's where the AIDS analogy fits best, because it was this plague that affected everybody who was vulnerable.
Yeah.
So no matter how rich, like Rock Hudson, right? No matter how rich you are, no matter how well placed you were still going to get this thing that couldn't be stopped. But without when you remove the possibility that the crunchy granola folks are going to save her, and in fact you make that compound really ambivalent in its purpose, and the
hugely
sense that, you can't necessarily, that maybe she's putting her faith in the wrong thing. It's terrifying. It's actually more unnerving to know that there is no one you can trust, that she can trust. And by that point, we are fully on her side, because I think it's pretty clear early on that whatever's happening to her, psychosomatic or otherwise, she's suffering.
Yeah.
And so,
regardless of whether those are more literal conditions that are like prescribed conditions, or could be prescriptive, or more psychosomatic in that. Yeah.
And Moore is such an appealing actor, and at that point was a relatively fresh face. I think I'd seen her in Vanya and Shortcuts, and
it's like a pretty extraordinary performance, and I mean that in that I would measure it among my very, very favorites in terms of. And these are where like some of the things I get interested in terms of the formal qualities of how the film is executed, and something I've always really loved about the film, and has certainly shaped my own cinema in terms of something I try to tend toward. Like, one of my biggest problems with cinema, even like films that I think are good films or interesting films, and certainly I'm not talking exclusively about Hollywood, I'm talking like in an indie sphere and that type of thing, is that cinema is so tied to traditions of cinema, and it's a very self-referential medium, and the biggest thing that I guess there's this thing that cinema and the mechanics of cinema are so like omnipresent in terms of the media that we've all grown up on and consumed, that like you don't have to be someone who is in film studies to understand the mechanics of the way story operates most of the time,
sure,
and I think yes, as a filmmaker you should know why 3-act structure is important, and you should know how it operates, but I think you can pick up anyone off the street and they understand the way that operates in a general sense. They can't articulate it the same way that someone who studies that can, but the reality is you sort of know those beats. And to me, I can often watch good stuff and work that has great performances, interesting subject matter, but it gets tied into like a narrative structure that is that no matter how many different moving parts you take in and out, there's an inevitability to everything that you're seeing. And that is like, and that's a sliding scale of how extreme it is. But like, one of the things that I love to have in watching anything is to have ways that fundamentally change that. And one thing that I think is so interesting about this film, which is something that I was interested in my film, is having a protagonist who has relatively little agency in terms of everything is sort of affecting that person, but they're not doing. I mean, you can say there's a degree of agency in her making the choice to go to, at the one point, to go to the camp to get help and that sort of thing. But most of what happens to her in that film is reactive. She's reacting to things that are happening to her, and added to that, I love that again in terms of the crisis in this film, that force in terms of this antagonistic force is something that is indescribable and invisible, but incredibly present, and validated too. Like we feel it. It's not just sort of like a conceptual thing you feel it emotionally. It emotionally resonates that way. And to me, I think that there's a degree that is much closer to reality in that proposition, as opposed to a standard setup of protagonist and antagonist. And I mean that in the way that, like, I'm just not a firm believer in good and evil. I think that is like a ridiculous construct, more or less. And I think that the ambiguity that ends up providing is so wonderful in that film, because to me, it's a very compelling element to follow throughout the film in terms of if she's lacking that agency and she's reacting so much more, and then she's reacting to a force that is omnipresent in so many ways, but also impossible to define. That, as a viewer, to me is so compelling, because I'm so curious to follow how this actually unfolds,
Sure, yeah.
And you do that with a still very satisfying ending, because the end of the film, sure, is like very ambiguous, but it seems completely appropriate to what we've experienced, and it seems to summarize that film, like that refrain she has to herself about loving herself in the end, when she's like so sort of fragile and like really wilting away in front of you, is like remarkably haunting, and does a nice job of summarizing that. But again, it's just that is like a conceptual construct that I think is so interesting about that film, and a really like important, compelling part of what I find super interesting, and what like I really think about when I start writing myself and start thinking of story and a way to tell story myself.
Yeah. Well, of course, if you begin with a concept that is loose enough that it could be anything and it could be anyone, to then whittle it away. That's the thing that really gripped me the most. I saw it theatrically with a crowd that had no idea how to process it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Other than the idea that they did not like the room tone. The sound, or the absence of sound, the way that
we can talk about this, because this is like my favorite formal quality. Go on, but this is my favorite formal quality.
Drove people insane. You could see, I saw it at the Bloor, and I sat far enough back because that's where the sweet spot for the speakers was. Yeah. Back in the day where you actually couldn't understand the dialogue if you were upstairs or on the right side of the theater. Okay, yeah. They've since fixed it, but kids, you have no idea. It was a losing nightmare. So I was sitting in a good spot for the sound, but that meant I could actually see the audience play.
Yeah.
See it work with the audience. And there was people that were squirming, and there was some tension in necks and things, and you could really feel that the audience did not like having to squirm. Yeah. The idea that the movie is going to trap you in this space with this person and then make you feel the air is just and fingernails on a chalkboard. And Haynes is so good at that. And I remember when the Laserdisc came out, I listened to it with headphones just to hear how it worked. Because it was so fascinating to me that at a time when sound reproduction, if you were Spielberg, you had Dolby Digital. Nobody else did. In 1995, it was
especially in the indie. I can only imagine what that would have been like tool-wise.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was Scorsese saying in '87 that he had a choice that he could make The Last Temptation of Christ for $6.5 million with stereo sound, or $6.5 million with a better. Maybe it was film stock or something, and he chose stereo because he wanted the score to whip through the theater.
Yeah.
And then almost 10 years later, here's Todd Haynes making the same kind of choice. It's like, I'm going to use sound in an assaultive fashion in a way that most audiences aren't ready for at the time. Like that, this was almost unprecedented.
Totally. I still think it's fairly unprecedented now. Like it's not something
much attention to it.
Yeah, not that many people. I mean, that was a thing that I like truly fell in love with, and then became like a formal thing that I just like constantly rip off because I'm so interested in the way that sound is used in that film. To me, it is like the main masterstroke of direction that I love the most. The film is full of like, I think it's one of the most exquisitely directed films, personally. But the particular use of sound, especially in being so aware of how important it would be to articulate the story that you're telling, and being so aware of that from the beginning is so important because sound has this, especially sound design, it has this incredible ability to alter our experience in such a profound, immediate way while still being so invisible, and still being really eclipsed in a certain sort of way. Like you feel, that's what I find so interesting about it. You can make the audience like feel so much, but you do it in a way that I think that they're not processing how they're, because like I think that like degree of anxiety and like discomfort, which is brilliant because you're essentially projecting Carol's experience and her sort of her terror onto the audience quite directly. Like that was my experience. Like when I first watched it and didn't really realize it's like things. The scene where she's driving and it's the exhaust, and the coughing, and then when she's at the dry cleaners, I think there's a vacuum on maybe there. Yeah,
that's the scene I always think.
Yeah, which is just extraordinary. And those are like more obvious ones. There's a couple. I think it's when she's sitting down having milk. When the maids are in the background talking, which again, like that as mise en scene, if we could talk like that is so extraordinary, that scene, in terms of like, again, this is a sound design thing as well, with a sort of like nod to her privilege and her detachment in terms of hearing, not even really seeing, but sort of just hearing this Spanish being spoken in the background of those two women.
Almost like a hum.
Like a hum. Like you don't, like they're...
She doesn't understand it, so we're not...
Yeah, and then we don't understand it either. And I mean, there's a few times he actually uses airplanes as well, like as a repeated motif, which I think is like extraordinarily beautiful and really, really, especially for something. I think that one is especially like maybe a bit sassy, but it works so well in terms of the idea of like the one thing you try and avoid in location sound all the time.
Right.
But it works so well as like this thing that is in reality constantly there and part of our daily lives, but he's able to subvert it and use it in this really effective way, I think, as, again, those forces that are out there that are sort of on top of her, you know what I mean, that she doesn't, that are not particularly visible. And again, like, I think it's just such an effective thing, and it's used so well in that film to create this really challenging, interesting ambiguity that keeps the audience on their toes. Like, I can't even remember if does the film have score in it?
I think there must be some.
I think there must be.
I want to say there is. I'm going to slowly pick up the Criterion and open the package to read.
No, but the fact that both you and I can't call to mind.
Yeah,
I've seen the movie so many times. You know what I mean?
Music composer and performer Ed Tomney, but I don't remember it.
Yeah, but I feel like if I watch this again right now, I've seen it a million times, but I feel like if I watch it again right now, there's probably more score than I remember in my mind being in the film.
I remember my impression of it is oppressive silence broken by quiet whispers of dialogue. Exactly.
And it's like, again, I just think silence is just one of these incredibly interesting, underutilized tools that does really, because I think what is so interesting about silence is thinking about film as something where the audience is interacting, where you're handing agency back to the audience. There is something very interesting about sitting in a quiet audience with people, like in terms of just the discomfort that gives you. And I think that it's used to such intelligent effect. And I mean, it obviously worked for me sitting and watching. I've seen it in a theater. I've got to see like a retrospective print of it when they did it. I think it was at the Cinematheque. But I still felt that just watching it on your own. Like that, the oppressiveness of silence is, I think, so much more effective and so much more profound than the scary sort of compositional music of like terror coming to, lurking around the corner to sort of consume you.
Yeah, and having just picked up the Blu-ray, I noticed it's in mono. which
Interesting.
I don't remember either. I guess that maybe the quote was about mixing rather than stereo, but
I guess we have. I guess it's good we have this DVD or this Blu-ray here.
I'm stunned because I do remember the sound being particularly effective. Although maybe I guess if the same sound is pumping out of all the speakers, then you do get a more oppressive experience.
Yeah, I mean, it would be an amazing thing to hear, like, I would love just a single commentary track about sound design, like with the sound designer and Todd Haynes on that, in terms of just, like, even just a nerdy technical one on achieving effect. Because, yeah, it's the thing that, to me, you know, again, like, it's also something I thought about in my own film, is, you know, what do you do when you have a protagonist who, by virtue of that character, is incredibly inarticulate and doesn't know really how to express themselves, and that is part of the challenge of your character that they're working through. And, you know, that's a big part of Carol's problem too. Like, for one, she doesn't know what is wrong with her, so obviously you have a challenge in articulating that, but she also is, you know, a part of a sect of society that we understand is probably not that communicative on deeper issues, right, you know what I mean? And ironically, same with the sort of the more like hippie commune group at the end either. Like, that so much of the dialogue is wonderfully superficial in terms of this sort of just like new agey, super like sort of surface speak, you know, that isn't really like anywhere close to deeper real therapy. It's almost because she's being talked to so much there, you know, it's not really about her expressing herself. So again, it's one of these things of like, when you do that, you know, you have to use the formal tools you have at your disposal in terms of visual language and with sound to express so many of those things that your characters are not expressing verbally. And again, like, that's one of those things where I think this film does such an extraordinary job of that, and I definitely feel like I stole that as just like something to think about, and just in terms of like a basic element of storytelling, that it can be so much more effective. And I think it also leaves space for, like, I know this is what it was like for me in terms of my own experience, which, you know, is very different than Carol's experience, but my own experience with anxiety is that amount of space has a really interesting effect, I think, on the audience in terms of allowing them to project themselves onto the character and put themselves in that space, which changes the experience in quite a way. Because I think the subjectivity of watching that film is altered pretty dramatically because you're placed at the center of it all of a sudden. And that's one of those things I love about being able to make work that maintains that degree of ambiguity. Like, I'm someone who really likes ambiguity with intention. Like, I'm sure I have a lot of film friends who will just completely disagree with me, that would argue more on the art for art's sake type of thing, and I can understand that, and I appreciate a lot of that. But I am definitely someone who, in terms of my own subjective preference, really, I love work that has enough room for me to have my own opinion and interpretation and understanding, but that I also feel that there is some intention to the decisions that are made, that there isn't like this ambivalence or flippantness to the decisions that are being made. That, like, to me, that always bothers me, and that's a bit of a pet peeve. But again, that's an opinion, because that's a broad scope of conversation there in terms of the merits of either one of those. But again, so this is why this film is like so special and significant to me, because of that impulse, which is something I really love. I think, like, I can't think of a film that more masterfully works in that way, in terms of having a huge amount of space for the viewer, and really trusting the viewer in a lot of ways, but also challenging the viewer and giving you something to work with and work out, which is, you know, such a great fundamental quality of that film.
Yeah, and and Haynes as a semiotician becomes even more interesting when you look at the deliberate ambiguities he's placed. Mm-hmm. Even the name Carol White, yes, it signifies white privilege and her WASP status and how she's never really been touched by anything. But it also, as you say, it makes her a blank. White is an empty space, and so you can fill that in with whatever you feel is appropriate. We bring our own biases, all the ones I just listed, for example, in how I perceive her. But she is protected. She's affluent. She's comfortable. She's taken care of. She doesn't seem to do anything. She doesn't seem to have a
the
purpose.
passivity of her, like, even from, again, it's like a masterstroke of direction of just giving you so much information. Even that, like really disquieting, like, sort of, I think it's maybe the second shot of the film, the sex scene at the beginning where she's like almost this empty vessel, you know what I mean? Which is,
she's just there.
Yeah, she's just there, you know what I mean? And like even the sort of like strange pat on the back that is like really removed from any degree of intimacy, like about as far, it's like less intimate than just not doing anything.
Yeah.
There's something about that is like so beautiful and incredible. But again, like she is just this remarkable, she's like this remarkable articulation of sort of like a vacuum of a character in terms of like us. And it's, I think this is also like to Haynes' credit, but also Julianne Moore's, it's amazing to have
essential.
Well, it's amazing to have a character who in so many ways you need to have her be so empty and so like almost a ghost of herself, you know? But at the same time, she doesn't feel like an empty character, you know? Like I think you feel so much of her humanity there, even if we feel like she's such a blank canvas in terms of a life that she has lived, or, you know, like that she is like the most sort of vanilla bland type of character that you possibly could have. But at the same time, it's counterbalanced by this remarkable degree of psychological complexity of her character. And that is like an incredible tension that I think is remarkably difficult to navigate. Certainly is something that comes a lot out of the writing and direction, but I can't imagine how flat this film would fall with a lesser actress.
Yeah.
You know?
I've interviewed Moore a number of times over the years, and I've never gotten around to, we've talked about Safe, but I've never gotten around to asking her the key questions about how she found this performance. Because what she has to do, like, what you have to do as an actor to intellectualize suffering so you can play it in the way that she does, because it's almost, there's this weird thing that people do. We've all been in rooms with people who've become very ill very quickly.
Yeah.
And your body goes into a kind of a diagnostic thing, and the eyes go blank, and you're clearly not, you're present, you're fully present in your body, trying to figure out what's happening, but it reads like a stroke or an episode or something. And she doesn't do that. She does something else. She does this raw animal panic that immediately recedes, and she tries to cover it up. And that's so unnerving in the split second every time it passes over her face, because it tells you everything. It tells you that she doesn't have any clue what's happening to her. She can't even process it. She can't feel it. She can't understand it. And the more that happens, the more monstrous, the more horrific the film becomes, and nothing is happening. Absolutely nothing is happening. It's all contained in her body.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scene that like perfectly articulates what you're talking about, and is like the one that I do count as my favorite scene in the film, just in terms of the most memorable, is the birthday party scene, which like that like slow push in on her is like the degree of emotional range that you journey through on that dolly shot, with her doing nothing but sitting still,
and slowly boiling away. Like, I don't know how to describe it.
Fucking extraordinary. Like that's like one of those things where I don't care how good of a director you are, like you're not directing that. You know, like that is something that comes from your performer, and you have to trust your performer to get there and do that. Sure, there are there's great sound design in that scene that makes it very, very unnerving. The shot itself is an extraordinary shot. The strange comforting too, you know, which is like really interesting as well, because it shows I think the comforting of her friends there also sort of shows the isolation, because it's like this, again, strange sort of pat on the back, hand on the arm. It's not like a full-bodied embrace, or it's not connected. Again, it's not connected to intimacy. I think like the lack of intimacy throughout this film is a really interesting, even just in production design. Like the house is beautiful, but there's nothing lived in about it. You know, like the plastic on the couch is again one of my favorite parts in that film. Like he does so much to, I mean, it's often talked about as, you know, being very sterile in terms of production design, but I do think that it's more, and that's true. But I think it's more about creating these spaces that are just completely void of any degree of warmth or intimacy, and that so much of what exists there is what's supposed to exist there if you imagine what, you know, success and achievement looks like, but there's no emotion connected to any of that. You know, it's literally just like, you know, it's like you're playing like doll, you know, like all these things are they might as well be imaginary because they are physically there, but they're not connected to, they're not truly connected to any real emotion, you know, even just as objects.
Yeah, no, it's neither of them worked on it. They had a decorator do it. They moved in, it was finished. It tells you everything about them.
Yeah. But
it also tells you what they're not bringing into their own home, which is any kind of life. And I the first time I saw it, I thought, oh, well, obviously the house is killing them.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't get sick.
Yeah.
And it's just not that.
Yeah.
And it's one more thing where you're presented with a solution, which is then pulled away from you the same way it's pulled away from her. And that there is no safety. There is no reassurance in not knowing.
Yeah, and which, again, is one of the things I love in terms of subverting your expectation of what you expect this film to be, which I think if it was an easier film from, like, a progressive liberal filmmaker would be this idea that, yes, there's more like this monolithic force, this sort of invisible force that that is essentially a stand-in for, like, successful, affluent suburban America and the toxicity of that, and that is what is killing these people or affecting these people, and that's like, again, because I think like we want those type of answers. They're very convenient, and that, you know, when you start watching the film, again, this is I already stated this, but that's what I love so much about it, is that's definitely what I felt the same way too. You feel like that's where it's going to, and that's where I think it like does an interesting thing when you start to intellectualize it more and you start to look at criticism. It does an interesting thing to kind of like challenging any viewer. Like, I don't think that there is, ironically, I was going to say, I don't think that there's a viewer who is safe. I didn't mean that to be so on the nose, but it is really interesting. Like, I think I love that the audience that it would appeal to the most, and there's just a reality, like, these films are seen mostly by a certain type of audience. That's, you know, I'm sure Todd Haynes, when he made it, didn't think that it was going to, like, you know, be a massive hit in suburban New Jersey or something like that. But I think the audience that would be the most sort of smug and feel good about that first half of the film, you know, is really challenged in the second half of the film. And that's what I think, again, is just really extraordinary about that it has quietly has this really beautiful take no prisoners sort of aspect to it.
Oh yeah, it's merciless. And again, the reason why it wouldn't work in the present day, well, you couldn't make it now, because now, unless there's some genius who can pull off a remake and put Gwyneth Paltrow in the lead, because she's already the thing. Like, there's already an element out there that is designed to counteract movies like this. And designed to tell you that no, life isn't the problem and you aren't the problem, and whatever it is, it can be fixed by this bespoke honey that we are selling. And the industry, I mean, it prefigures anti-vaxxers, it prefigures the rise of alternate news and belief circles and everything, and it's so distressingly on the nose that I'm wondering if maybe that's why it went away for a while. It just needed to wait and come back when people could start realizing, oh, what was that movie I remember about the sick person? And here we are, and it's terrifyingly more relevant than ever.
I know. I was just actually going to say that it's like almost like a bit horrifying, its relevance, you know, and in terms of especially the fact that it maybe is speaking more to like universal human symptoms than a moment in time, you know, and that's what I think is probably, I'm actually literally just thinking this out now. It's not so much a thought that I've had before, because I've actually probably thought less of it in its historical context, because that's not the way I viewed it.
It's not how you experienced it.
But, you know, but it's very true what you're saying. It's one of those things that I think, if you look at its relevance now, does speak more to a bit of sort of, I guess, just a bit of a sort of damning truth about a degree of human experience and culture, in terms of the fact that something like that film isn't just tied to one issue, isn't tied to, sure, like, obviously Todd, like, yes, it's inspired by so much of, I'm sure, what he lived through and the friends that he lost and what he experienced through that time, and certainly probably feeling under siege himself, just being in the middle of that community.
Well, it's the line from Longtime Companion, right? I feel like something is stalking me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's externalized here. He's actually made it into a malevolence that we can't understand. Like, it's not bloodborne. It's not a disease as we understand it, because whatever it is can't be quantified. And by trapping us all in that space with her and leaving us where it leaves us, it's absolutely the most unnerving thing you can imagine. This isn't over, and it might never be. And this is where we have to go. We have to leave, because it's just beyond this. It's literally unimaginable. I can't show you anymore.
Yeah.
It's just so
I know.
horrible.
It's really, it's really fascinating, and it's just one that I still think. I've thought it's just an interesting thing in terms of thinking about the holding up factor, because again, it's I think maybe the fact that I haven't even thought about it holding up so well over time is sort of, case in point, in the degree that, like, I've never, there is a timeless quality about it. Like, yes, it is, in one way, yes, it's clearly Reagan era America, and it's a very specific place, but I think in terms of, like, a stand-in for a Western sort of 20th century experience, there is a degree of, and maybe it's tied into, like, a bit of a masterstroke of just setting, in that, like, California, because of media, becomes that placeholder for all of us as, like, an understanding of what is a normal view of the world. Right. Like, even if you've lived in Canada your entire life, like me, growing up as a kid in Banff in the mountains and being to California once or twice, but that's like Disneyland vacations as a kid or whatever.
Right. But if you watch TV, or you saw
we watch TV,
you know what Los Angeles is like.
Yeah, and we understand that, and it doesn't, and it shows us a familiar type of Los Angeles too. It doesn't show us like an underbelly of Los Angeles or something. It shows it, I think, in a unique way, and it looks at it in an interesting way. But I think that's something, like, just even in terms of setting of that film, and how used to that space we are, and again, this goes back to even just little elements like production design. The fact that film, again, when I think of it, like, this cover, we're looking at the Criterion cover, says so much about the film to me, in terms of, like, this pastel sort of tone, which, again, like, that's a small note, but I do think in terms of just that look and feel of that film as just being like this. The whole setting is this remarkable standard bearer for what is seen as a Western norm. And I think, like, even if you're in Europe, because of the way that we have processed and understood the world through so much of the dominance of what Hollywood puts out to the world, right? So the film on so many, I was about to say superficial, but that's not true, because it's so important to the formal construction of the film. But on so many of these surface levels, at least, is really giving us almost the most, standard bearer, bland sort of backdrop for this to be set. And I think that, again, that's also probably why it is more disquieting and disturbing and unsettling in terms of the way that it unfolds and the way that it operates.
Yeah, and it's. The impenetrability of those surfaces is something I come back to a lot, because there is no scene behind them. Like, everything is a facade. Even Carol is a facade for herself in a weird way, which just unpacks into so many other things that are disquieting about the film, that are unnerving about the film, is that we know who she is because we've seen her for 2 hours. By the end of the film, we've experienced her life with her, but we don't know what's doing it to her. We don't know what it is about her that made her vulnerable. We never find the way in, and that's why the ending is so powerful. I think is because who is she talking to?
I think that's a totally great point, and I think this idea of facade with her is super interesting because, and again, I think this is maybe one of those things that the film operates in an interesting way in terms of how it ends up resonating with a to me, a lot, very universally. Like, I think, like, it's a challenging film, sure, so it certainly has an audience, but I think those people who see it, regardless of your background, it's amazing how many people can find something to anchor into a character who would seemingly have so little to possibly anchor in, because she's almost without a personality. But what I think that comes down to, which I'm really interested in, is, like, the performative nature of her life. Like, she knows how to do the performance of her life, right. You know, which is, like, again, going to the people who decorate your house. Like, you have a set. It's like a home is supposed to be, in our imagination at least, is supposed to be the place that is the reflection of ourselves. You know, like, we collect these things, we put these things here because we like them, and it says something about ourselves. And even that is something that is done by other people for her. And, you know, she goes through, clearly, in the scenes that we see her, like, at lunch with friends and that type of thing, aerobics classes and those type of things, even though those scenes are often overshadowed with the menace of what is sort of haunting her, we see her doing the performative nature of what she needs to do to fit into where she lives very well. You know, she really knows how to do it. And I think that is... but what is interesting about that is she can play the part, but what is left there after you remove the performance, right? And that's sort of like what I think is so disturbing and fascinating and interesting about the I Love You is it's like the I Love You is, especially in the context of the new agey sort of way it's framed there, is sort of like this way of saying, like, I love you to this deepest part of yourself and accepting yourself. But if you don't even understand who you are, that's what is really disturbing about that moment, because she's sort of saying that to, again, this facade of herself that she's sort of been playing out. And I think, you know, obviously the character is an extreme degree, but I think that is something that has a universal element, because we all play versions of ourselves in our lives. I think that, you know, that has become painfully apparent with, you know, and this is a boring example because we all know it, but it is painfully apparent with, like, how we curate our lives at this day and age, because we do it more actively than we did in the past, or it's more obvious how actively we do it. But I think that is something that is really interesting, because when we look at especially things around mental illness and these type of things in terms of depression, anxiety, and a lot of that stuff is tied to identity. You know what I mean? And I think that there is definitely, I'm not saying this is the only element that sort of resonates, but I do think that there is this very, very interesting dynamic in that film that, in terms of challenging all of us, is sort of challenging us to think about the performative aspect of our life in terms of how we fit into the world around us, and if you peel that back, what version of yourself is behind that, you know, which I think is something that's super interesting in that film, because that is one of the most terrifying parts of Carol, is, like, if you peel that back, who is there? Someone is there. Like, we feel for her, but it's very difficult to understand who is that person who's left over.
Yeah, which is kind of the same thing that Hello Destroyer is about, which leads us perfectly to the last question of the podcast, which is there anything of Safe that you've used, lifted, borrowed, stolen, incorporated into your creative DNA? And if so, what would it be?
Man, that's a big question. Yep. Because
go out strong.
No, it's a great one. But I mean, that's also a big reason why I chose this film, because there's a lot of it, and I've touched on some of it before. Sure, yeah. I definitely think, as I was saying before, the idea of a big one is the idea of the protagonist who doesn't have a lot of agency, and that's something that I was really interested in. And in terms of this idea of identity, that is also a strong parallel for me, in that Tyson is a character who doesn't know himself very well. Like, he is so, just like Carol is so defined by her environment, so is he, in terms of someone who, it might have even been in your review, which I actually think was great, and I apologize if it wasn't your review, but someone, I think it must have been yours, talked about how, you know, there's a lack of a three-dimensional element to Tyson as a character throughout the film. And that is actually, I think it's a fair criticism, but it's also a bit of a deliberate choice, in that I don't think he's a character who really knows himself very well at this point, you know? And to me, so much of his identity in our film, much like Carol, is defined by what is around him and how he feels like he fits into that place. but he doesn't really know himself that well, which, this is a bit different than Safe, but like that leads to his ultimate crisis, which is a lot about an inability to communicate, because I don't think he doesn't really have the skills to do that. He's only been taught to communicate in one way, sort of through violence. So, when he needs to ask for help, that's why he's enacting violence upon himself, because that's really the only tools he has. But it comes back to this core thing, which I think is like a really haunting, powerful sort of crisis for a character or for us as people, is when we feel like we're not grounded in some sort of sense of guiding force for ourselves, so that's like, I don't know. I've always been interested. I often write very passive characters. I don't very often write characters who drive narrative and drive story. Like, I really, because I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess I make a ton of decisions in my life and, that sort of thing. But I just think that this sort of hero's journey type of narrative that we often are on in so many films is sort of a bit removed from reality of life. There's just so much of our lives that is dictated by conditions that we're reacting to. Not all people are as passive as characters like Carol and Tyson are, of course. But I do think that it's one of those things that I think there's a lot less agency in a lot of our lives than we like to imagine that we maybe have. So
that sounds fair.
Yeah, there's that, and I mean, and then the big thing is just formal qualities. Like just the way I definitely say it operates in different ways, but especially the sound design stuff. And we talked a lot about that. But so much of the things that we love, I've tried to employ and lift directly from that in terms of storytelling in my film as well. So yeah.
Okay. It did strike me, you'd mentioned this earlier as well, that Tyson doesn't really know what to say to people. And I find it fascinating that now, if you remade, what Tyson does is that he says what people think.
Yeah.
He says what he thinks people want him to say.
Yeah.
And it's always this boilerplate cliche.
Yeah.
And it never helps him, not once.
No. Never.
And Carol doesn't even know how to articulate what's happening to her. And if you remade Safe now, she would. Like, she'd have an entire lexicon of stuff, and it wouldn't help her either.
Yeah.
Whatever it is isn't the thing that she thinks it is.
Yeah, exactly. Because she would be able to source information. Yeah, if you remade Safe now, like probably 2/4 of the first half would be her on a computer, like researching stuff. So I'm glad it's not set now, because that's hard to watch.
Although you could get a solid ending, or if she's walking around reading an iPad and just walks into traffic, at least it's over.
Maybe that's what I'll try and do. I'll try and somehow do this version of Safe as my next film, the remake of Safe. Okay. Oh, that would be terrible. No, but I think it's a very interesting point. And I don't know, like. It seems like a contradiction that, like, characters who are very passive and, like I said, without much agency would be more complex or interesting, but I think they are, because motivation is an easy thing to understand. If we have stakes and we're like, this person needs to do this and this because of this, right. A plus B equals C.
Yeah. We have 3 days to get to the boat before the monkey kills us.
Yeah, and that's compelling. It is compelling because we can understand that. But what is more compelling to me is, again, I think that and this one thing I feel about film in general, I think, if there's one thing that's true to storytelling, for me at least, is the idea that humans are inherently curious and we want to figure things out. We want that's the success of our species, right? Like, we have this profound degree of curiosity and we want to work through things. And so that's what really interests me about characters like this, is I think, again, as long as you're not too condescending or pretentious in terms of how you treat it, because you can be really alienating, and that's again where I think it can become problematic. But I do think an audience will give you a lot of leeway in terms of ambiguity if they feel, or with these type of characters, if they feel like there's some entry point for them to try and figure it out. Whether or not you reach a conclusive answer, or whether or not they reach the answer that maybe I would reach, that to me is irrelevant. But I do think that there's a way to invite people in to engage more with these type of characters based on just the fact that we want to figure things out. And that was like a fundamental thing to the construction of the narrative of my film, which again is I think think, very true in this film. I don't know if that's a philosophy that Haynes has by any means, but I mean, from my experience of watching that film, that's what it felt like to me. So, I mean, realistically, it's a big question, because I can say, like, there's probably 10 things that I stole, like, not 10 little moments, 10 big ideas and things that I've stolen from Safe, and probably I'm sure I will continue to for the rest of my career.
Well, it's pretty rich. I mean, there's a vein in there.
There's a lot. Oh yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there, and I guess it's one of those films that I marvel at so much in terms of intention of direction. Like I really, and maybe that's like a big. When you were talking about this before, this is another element that I love about Haynes. Like, my background was, I went to art school instead of film school, and I think Haynes went to film school, but definitely studied art, and he's obviously very connected to a lot of modern artists and modern art tradition in America. And one thing that I've always really loved about his work, and that I think a lot about in terms of my own, in terms of writing and composition and just construction of narrative, is I really do love his like deep investment in semiotics, and the idea that there is, much like art, that there is information and there can be information and intention in every gesture, and every gesture in terms of every decision that you're making. I really like, to me, that's a very, just as a general approach, that's a very exciting and engaging way to make a film. That there are a lot, like for example, to me, there's a focus in terms of what I'm interested in on the film, in terms of exploring some systemic issues of violence in our culture, and a degree of cultural culpability that exists there. But even, I wanted to make a film that was very Canadian, and so hockey is a bit tongue-in-cheek of choosing a hockey film, because I also think that it's kind of the worst cliche stereotype of English Canadian film. So there's a playfulness, but like that institution was something I needed. I mean, if I was doing it in the States, it would probably be like the military, for example.
Right, sure.
But one thing that Haynes does so well, that was something I've definitely thought about in terms of more on the semiotic side, is the degree of, I'm making a film about violence that's specifically placed in Canada. So even if I don't want it to take over the film or be the focus of the film, because it wasn't this film in particular, not commenting or have some allusion towards colonial history and colonial violence that we're living within, and the legacy of that, was really important to me. So like choosing the name The Warriors and having that iconography that is Indigenous Canadian in the headdress and those type of things, and we obviously have one Indigenous Canadian character in there, which again was a very deliberate thing in terms of being dominated by mostly white men in that film, yeah. Even including the exclusion of women in that film. That was like a very deliberate choice in terms of this setting up this very sort of patriarchal sort of structure of the world that we were looking at. But that being able to find ways to comment on that stuff that is in the DNA of your film, where it's important and present, but also, especially with the Warriors stuff, it's like something that is completely visible and on the surface, but equally as invisible in terms of what it's actually talking about. Right. And I think that, again, that's something that I would say Haynes does in this film, and probably in all of his work. He's so good at staying very focused on the story he's telling, but giving you so many strands to follow in terms of the way that it interacts with other ideas and other issues and that sort of thing. So yeah, that is maybe more of just an inspiration that I then try and take into some of my own work. So
yeah, well, I'm glad you're putting it out there for people to pick up, because it's important.
Yeah,
it shouldn't just be one thing.
No, because life is not like that. You know what I mean? I think that we're constantly confronting, even if you want to be issue based on anything, even if you think you have a political agenda on one thing, like the world is so interconnected that there is just a degree of these things crossing over and being related to each other and referencing each other, that I think it's very hard to be incredibly prescriptive or want to be so direct that you feel like you can keep it contained in one, in one specific sort of stream of thought or stream of conversation. I think that is probably a nearly impossible task to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My thanks to Kevan Funk, whose feature debut Hello Destroyer is playing at the TIFF Bell Lightbox in Toronto and the Mayfair Theatre in Ottawa right now. And it's booked at the Van City Theatre in Vancouver, March 21st and 25th. More screenings are planned across Canada over the spring, so check out hellodestroyer.net for the full list. And if you're curious about the short film that inspired Kevan's feature, just search Vimeo for Destroyer, and you can watch it there. You can find Kevan on Twitter at Kevan Funk, Kevan with an A in all one word, and you can find Safe on DVD and Blu-ray in a pristine special edition from the Criterion Collection. Oh, and here's something interesting. The movie was originally released with surround sound, and the initial Laserdisc and DVD did feature a Matrix surround audio. But the Criterion editions, approved by Haynes himself, only offer mono audio. So that's interesting. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner, and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. If you want to leave a review on iTunes, that would be very kind of you. Last week's episode kind of poked us in the stats, so, let's keep that going. That was cool. Thanks for listening.